India is now the world's fifth largest economy, surpassing the United Kingdom. But can it truly rise to the ranks of an economic superpower? Or are there hidden challenges that could slow its progress? In this video, we'll break down India's economic strengths, the key roadblocks it faces, and the major steps it must take to compete with global giants like China. And stick around until the end, because we'll reveal whether India has what it takes to become the next global powerhouse. To understand India's economic future, we need to compare it with its biggest rival, China. Both nations have massive populations, rich histories, and ambitious economic goals. But despite these similarities, China has surged far ahead in terms of GDP, infrastructure, and global influence. Let's put this into perspective. In 1980, India's economy was about 64% the size of China's. Today, that number has shrunk to just 17%. If India had grown at the same pace as China over the past few decades, its economy would be worth over $10 trillion instead of its current $3.47 trillion. So, why has China taken such a huge lead, and why has India lagged behind? The first major reason is rapid industrialization. When China embraced economic reforms in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping, it prioritized large-scale manufacturing and infrastructure development. Special economic zones, SEZs, were created to attract businesses, and China became the world's factory, producing everything from electronics to steel at an unmatched scale. India, on the other hand, took a different path. While it liberalized its economy in 1991, the focus remained on services rather than manufacturing. Sectors like IT and software boomed, but large-scale industrialization didn't take off the way it did in China. The second key factor is foreign investment and exports. When China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, it opened its doors to global trade and investment like never before. Foreign companies rushed in, drawn by cheap labor, efficient supply chains, and government incentives. This flood of investment helped China build world-class infrastructure and expand its exports. By contrast, India struggled with bureaucratic red tape, inconsistent policies, and a slow-moving approval process, making it harder for foreign businesses to set up and thrive. Finally, China's government policies and infrastructure investments have played a crucial role in its success. High-speed rail networks, modern highways, massive ports, and advanced logistics hubs made it easier for businesses to operate efficiently. Meanwhile, India's infrastructure, though improving, still lags behind, with challenges in transportation, power supply, and digital connectivity slowing down economic growth. But does this mean India will always be behind China? Or does it have the potential to close the gap and emerge as a global superpower? Let's break it down. One of India's greatest strengths, and perhaps its biggest opportunity, is its demographics. With a population of over 1.4 billion people, India has a young and dynamic workforce. In fact, nearly half of the country's population is under the age of 25, and 65% is under 35. That means India has one of the largest working-age populations in the world, something China is starting to lose as its population ages. A young workforce should be an economic goldmine, but here's the challenge: it's not being used effectively. Right now, 40% of young Indians are unemployed, and labor force participation is just 40%, which is one of the lowest in the world. In comparison, China's labor force participation rate is around 68%. That means a huge portion of India's potential workforce isn't contributing to the economy as much as it could. And then there's the issue of female employment. If more Indian women entered the workforce, the country could add 235 million workers and boost GDP by a staggering 27%. But right now, less than 25% of Indian women are working or looking for jobs, which is significantly lower than in countries like China and Vietnam, where female labor participation is over 60%. So what's stopping India from fully utilizing its workforce? There are a few major factors at play. Education and skills mismatch. While millions of young Indians graduate each year, many lack the skills needed for high-paying jobs, especially in technology, engineering, and finance. Job creation isn't keeping pace. The economy isn't generating enough formal sector jobs, forcing many into unstable or low-paying informal work. Social and cultural barriers. Women face societal expectations, workplace discrimination, and a lack of safe working environments keeping many from participating in the labor force. So can India turn its demographic advantage into real economic power? The answer lies in reforms, innovation, and investment in its people. Let's explore what needs to change. India's young population could be its greatest strength, but without the right education and jobs, it could become its biggest crisis. Right now, unemployment remains high, especially among young Indians. Only 20% of young workers are in high-skilled professions, which means most are either underemployed or stuck in low-paying, informal jobs. The root of this problem? A struggling education system. India spends just 2% of its GDP on education, one of the lowest rates in the world. Compare that to China, which spends nearly 4%, or Brazil and South Africa, which invest even more. Without proper funding, many Indian schools and universities lack modern facilities, well-trained teachers, and industry-relevant curricula. The result? A skills gap. Many graduates enter the job market without the necessary expertise in technology, engineering, and finance, sectors that drive high-income economies. And with automation and artificial intelligence reshaping industries, the lack of skilled workers could leave millions without stable employment. If India doesn't act fast, its demographic advantage could turn into a demographic disaster, a scenario where millions of young people remain jobless, leading to economic stagnation and social unrest. But even if India fixes its education and employment crisis, there's another major hurdle: infrastructure and foreign investment. India has some of the world's worst infrastructure bottlenecks: overcrowded roads, outdated railway systems, and unreliable power grids. These issues slow down business growth, increase production costs, and make it harder for companies to operate efficiently. One clear sign of this decline is in fixed capital formation, which refers to investment in infrastructure and assets. In 2007, India's fixed capital formation was 36% of GDP. Today, it has dropped to just 29%. Meanwhile, China's rate remains above 40%, allowing it to build high-speed rail networks, modern airports, and smart cities that attract global businesses. And then there's foreign direct investment, FDI. In 2008, India was attracting 3.6% of GDP in FDI. Today, that number has fallen to just 1.4%. Compare that to China, which continues to bring in massive foreign investments, fueling its manufacturing, technology, and infrastructure sectors. Without major reforms in infrastructure and investment policies, India risks losing out to other emerging markets like Vietnam and Indonesia, which are quickly becoming preferred destinations for global businesses. So, what can India do to turn the tide? It's time to examine the key strategies that could help India unlock its full potential and compete on the world stage. India's economy may be growing, but it's walking a financial tightrope. The country's fiscal deficit is rising, and its debt to GDP ratio has climbed to nearly 90%. To put that into perspective, developing economies generally aim to keep debt under 60% of GDP to ensure long-term stability. India is already way past that threshold. So can India sustain its economic growth without falling into a debt trap? A high debt to GDP ratio means that a huge chunk of government revenue goes toward paying off interest, leaving less money for infrastructure, education, and social programs. If the debt keeps rising, India risks higher inflation, lower investor confidence, however, weaker economic growth. Despite these risks, major credit rating agencies like Moody's and S&P still see India as a strong long-term investment, as long as it implements structural reforms to reduce deficits and boost productivity. But time is running out. If India doesn't fix its fiscal imbalances, it could face slower growth, currency devaluation, or even an economic crisis. And speaking of economic growth, let's talk about India's export and manufacturing sector. For decades, India has wanted to become a global manufacturing powerhouse like China. But there's a problem. Bureaucratic red tape slows down business operations, making it difficult for companies to set up factories. Rigid labor laws make hiring and firing workers complicated, discouraging companies from expanding. A lack of skilled workers means that industries struggle to find employees trained in advanced manufacturing and technology. These issues have held India back from competing with China, Vietnam, and even Bangladesh, which have become manufacturing hubs by offering business-friendly policies and a skilled workforce. But here's the good news. Global supply chains are shifting away from China. The US and other Western nations are looking for alternative manufacturing partners, and India has a golden opportunity to step in. The question is, can India reform its policies, invest in skill development, and attract major multinational companies before other nations take the lead? Coming up next, we'll dive into India's biggest opportunities and whether it truly has what it takes to become the next global economic superpower. India has all the potential to become an economic superpower, but potential alone isn't enough. To truly compete with China and lead the global economy, India must take bold action. First, education and skill development must be a top priority. Right now, only 20% of India's young workforce is in high-skilled jobs, and the country spends just 2% of its GDP on education, far lower than China, Brazil, or even South Africa. If India wants to unlock its demographic advantage, it must invest in vocational training programs to prepare workers for high-paying industries, higher education reforms to match global standards, technology and digital literacy to stay competitive in the AI-driven economy. Next, infrastructure and the ease of doing business must improve. India's roads, ports, and power supply bottlenecks make it difficult for businesses to thrive. Fixed capital formation, the money spent on infrastructure, has dropped from 36% of GDP to just 29%. If India wants to attract global investors, it must fix these gaps immediately. And speaking of investors, India needs to boost foreign direct investment and exports. Right now, FDI has fallen from 3.6% of GDP to just 1.4%, and India's share of global exports is a mere 1.8%. Compare that to China, which dominates 14% of global trade. To fix this, India must cut down bureaucratic red tape to make business operations smoother, reform labor laws to make hiring and scaling easier for companies, focus on high-value exports like electronics, pharmaceuticals, and green energy instead of just textiles and raw materials. Finally, India cannot afford to ignore half of its population. Right now, female workforce participation is one of the lowest in the world. If India can bring more women into the workforce, it could add 235 million new workers and boost GDP by 27%. That's the equivalent of adding an entire economy the size of Germany to India's GDP. So can India truly become an economic superpower? The answer depends on the choices made today. If India invests in education, infrastructure, business reforms, and gender equality, it has everything it needs to rival China and dominate the global economy. But if these challenges aren't addressed, India could fall into the middle-income trap, never reaching its full potential. What do you think? Will India rise to the challenge, or will these obstacles hold it back? Let us know